We're going to go ahead and begin with our first paper this morning from Joel Reemtsma. He's from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's going to be reading for us The Punishment of the Powers, Deuteronomy 32, and Psalm 82 as the backdrop for Isaiah 34. Go ahead.
All right, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
This paper I'm going to be reading for you is a paper I did for my coursework there at Dallas Seminary, PhD student about to enter the dissertation phase. It's a bit long, so I'm not going to read it to you. I've given you some notes, and I'm going to basically follow these, and hopefully we can keep it lively that way and leave you some time for some questions. And along the way, I'll read some excerpts here and there. So Isaiah 34 was singled out as an exemplar of poetic beauty by none other than James Muhlenberg, the father of rhetorical criticism, as he's sometimes known. Muhlenberg thought of Isaiah 34 as an example of Hebrew craftsmanship and artistry. And his essay is actually the literary characteristics of Isaiah 34. But I think that the message of Isaiah 34 has been obscured, or at least one of its main emphases has been lost. So what we're going to do here is I want to read a few verses from Isaiah 34 just to get us into the text a little bit. And then we'll look at some of these major exegetical challenges that arise from the text. So Isaiah 34, this is the Net Bible, and we'll just read the first 7 verses or so. It says, "Come near, you nations, and listen. Pay attention, you people. The earth and everything in it, and everything it contains must listen, the world and everything that lives in it. For the Lord is angry at all the nations and furious with all their armies." That's the Hebrew Tzavah, host. "He will annihilate them and slaughter them. Their slain will be left unburied. Their corpses will stink, and the hills will soak up their blood. All the stars in the sky will fade away or rot. The sky will roll up like a scroll, and all its stars will wither, like a leaf withers and falls from a vine, or a fig withers and falls from a tree. He says, indeed, my sword has slaughtered heavenly powers. Look, now it descends on Edom, on the people I will annihilate in judgment." So actually we'll stop there. So major exegetical challenges that arise from Isaiah chapter 34, and you can see the first couple even in these first few verses. And again, if you didn't get the handouts, there's 2 pages on the seats right as you come in the door if you want to go ahead and get those. But that'll kind of help orient you to what I'm doing here. The first one is, why is the Lord angry with the nations in this chapter? No reason is given. The second one is, what role do the heavens and the heavenly powers play in the punishment of the nations? Third one, why does God seem to attack the heavenly host as well as the human host? Number 4, why is Edom singled out for judgment in Isaiah chapter 34? What is its relationship to the nations? So I could sort of summarize those 4 questions under one heading: who is being judged and why? And I want to read to you a little bit of the paper here. Who is being judged and why? Confronted with the initial imperatives, the interpreter will be inclined to ask why the nations are to gather. The question cannot really be separated from the matter of who is being judged and why, but we'll try to deal with them in turn. Considering verse 1, Wildberger compares the summons to Deuteronomy 32:1, wherein the heavens and the earth are invoked as witnesses. He points out similar phraseology in chapter 48:14-16. Isaiah 48:14-16. Kaiser, that would be Otto Kaiser, by contrast, argues that Isaiah 34 summons the nations together for the purposes of judgment, so the nations themselves are being judged, so that they can hear their sentence pronounced. So one can sympathize with both views. So in Isaiah 34, the fact that God's wrath is explicitly directed at the nations, the fact that Yahweh's wrath is explicitly directed at the nations supports Kaiser, and yet the fact that no reason is given for God's anger seems to support Wildberg. That Edom is later singled out might also be taken in support of Wildberger's view, casting the nations of the world as witnesses to the destruction of that particular nation. So to break that stalemate, some scholars have suggested one ought to assume that the readers already know why Yahweh is so furious. For instance, Watts claims that the 5th century audience would have been well acquainted with Edomite atrocities. On the other hand, Smith appeals to the literary context, arguing that the oracles against the nations, chapters 13 to 23, have sufficiently detailed their crimes for the wrath that is brought down upon Edom. Still, another solution is offered by Oswald, who contends that the reason for Yahweh's wrath is implicit in the concept of the ban mentioned in the following verse. So, to summarize that excerpt, who is being judged and why? We have different groups mentioned. We have the nations who are summoned. We have, in verse 4, the stars in the sky and the heavenly host who are targeted, who seem to be targeted as the agents, not agents of wrath, but, well, the target of wrath. And Edom is singled out for judgment. So who is being judged and why? Those are the major exegetical challenges, 1 through 4 right here. And then I've got a few others. So on the top of the sheet here, number 5 is, why is God's judgment portrayed in specifically sacrificial terms? This is actually not as common as you might think in the prophets. Number 6, what is the significance of the list of obscure animals and their activities towards the end of the oracle? So if you have a Bible, you can look down there towards the end. And there's this long stretch here where we got jackals and ostriches, wild animals, hyenas, goats, nocturnal animals. There's some debate about Lilith there, which we won't get into. Owls, hawks, etc. What's the significance of all those animals, and why are they mentioned there? And why is their inhabitation and their possession of the land given in terms of allotment and inheritance? Those are very freighted concepts in Hebrew Bible, of course. Number 8, what is the scroll of the Lord, and what does that imagery convey? So if you look down in verse 16, carefully read the scroll of the Lord, or seek and read. What's that? And why is it in there? And then number 9, what is the relationship of Isaiah 34 to the rest of Isaiah? And so here we got to go back a little bit in history. We can go all the way back to Bernard Doom, of course, one of the most famous Isaiah scholars, who located Isaiah 34 and 35, who associated these chapters with Deutero-Isaiah. And we'll use those terms for convenience right here without necessarily accepting the compositional scheme that introduces. But the 3 sections of Isaiah we'll refer to that way without accepting the idea that there are these multiple authorships and sources. So Doom is the scholar, of course, late 19th, early 20th century, who brought to our attention the servant songs and who proposed a Trito-Isaiah, and who argued that Isaiah 24 to 27, the so-called Isaianic apocalypse, was very late, possibly even 2nd century. Now, some of those conclusions have been moved away from by the critical community, but this idea that 34 and 35 continues to be associated with the second part of Isaiah, with Deutero-Isaiah. And so you have Marvin Pope of Anchor Bible fame who confirmed that assessment, and Torrey actually thought that chapters 34 and 35 initially formed an introduction to Deutero-Isaiah, which was then flipped with the historical interlude in chapter 36 to 39 to sort of form this interlocking section between the two, first Isaiah and second Isaiah. So there's this close association with Isaiah 34 and its sort of twin or mirror chapter, 35, with Deutero-Isaiah. But we have to wonder why this oracle, which is ostensibly against Edom, why it doesn't appear in the oracles against the nations in chapter 13 and following. This is sort of orphaned, as some scholars refer to it. So that's sort of the past scholarly approaches that we've looked at, and the general characterizations of Isaiah 34, views of the chapter and its significance, generally reflect this emphasis on Edom, and for good reason. Edom is mentioned several times in the chapter. So for Wildberger, it's a judgment upon Edom with the nations summoned as witnesses. For Claire Matthews, and I got to apologize, I put an extra T in her name. The book is Defending Zion. A judgment upon Edom with a late apocalyptic addition. So this matter about the stars falling from heaven is an addition by a later editor, author, and that the original oracle was Edom, and then it was given an eschatological flair. There's also this view, Kaiser and DQ and others, that the judgment upon all nations is in the chapter, but that Edom is singled out as an exemplar. This is what's going to happen to all of them, or this is the worst of the bunch. Meilenberg goes a slightly different direction, and he emphasizes the cosmic dimensions of the text. So we have mountains melting with blood in the chapter. We have Yahweh's sword in heaven. And we have, we'll get to this a little bit later, but we have tohu and bohu. God will stretch out the plumb line of confusion. And that collocation is very significant, of course, because it seems to imply a return to chaos. So Meilenberg emphasized the cosmic dimensions to the text, and that's the direction I want to go with it. But the problem with his treatment, and I think with many treatments, and here we're into the deficiencies in past scholarly approaches, is there's a tendency to downplay or dismiss apocalyptic imagery. So, as I just mentioned, Matthews will say this is a late addition. Other scholars who don't necessarily take that redactional scheme will still kind of dismiss verse 4 in particular. The stars in the sky fading away and rotting, and the sky rolling up like a scroll. That's stereotypical prophetic language that we can sort of just read over, because we're dealing with human judgment here, and the prophets sort of get carried away sometimes. The problem is that this is not stereotypical language. That image isn't found directly anywhere else. We have the idea of Yahweh splitting the sky and other things like that, but the sky rolling up like a scroll and the stars withering like leaves and fading away and actually rot, I think, is a better translation there. We hopefully will get there. But this is not stock imagery or stereotypical imagery. So I don't think we can just pass over the apocalyptic connotations here and say, well, we've got a really severe judgment on Edom and that's it. In line with that sort of deficiency has been this tendency to deal with the exegetical oddities of the passage in a piecemeal fashion. So you've got these 9 questions, and again we could add some others to them. But the general approach has been, I'm going to look at this issue and make a decision, and then I'm going to go through the text till I come to the next one and make a decision. And the problem with that is it doesn't give us a synthesis of the chapter as a whole. And that's what I'm going to try to offer you today. There's a tendency to appeal to stages of composition or redaction too quickly to explain difficulties. There's a tendency to ignore thematic connections to Isaiah, the first and third sections. Again, using first and third Isaiah as terms for convenience. Due to that scholarly association of chapter 34 with the second section of Isaiah. I think there are some really important thematic connections that we're going to bring out a bit later. So, with all that said, I want to lay out my thesis for you. And that is that the conceptual and theological background of this passage is found in Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, particularly Deuteronomy 32:8. And we'll get there in just one second. But I think the implications of that are that the primary target of God's wrath in Isaiah chapter 34 are the divine powers, the rebellious celestial host. And the reason for God's wrath against them is that they have failed to mediate His rule justly. I think Edom is selected as the human associate or human representative of the divine powers, or perhaps the land of Edom is the setting for this judgment on the celestial powers for thematic reasons, and that we should not go looking for historical atrocities we shouldn't go looking for historical reasons why Judah hated Edom. There were those, but I don't think those explain this text, or at least they're not the primary or sole explanation. And I say that because Wildberger in his commentary has a very lengthy discussion of why Judah hated Edom so much, because there's a surprisingly high amount of Edom polemic in the prophets. And of course, we know there was, from Obadiah and some other texts, there seemed to have been involved with the Babylonian sack of the city. Also, and I'll mention this a bit later, but Edom was once a vassal to Judah and then rebelled. So there are some historical collisions there. But I don't think that's the only reason or the foremost reason, and we'll get there. But that's my thesis, that the primary focus of the oracle, or one of its main foci, I would say, is the judgment of the celestial host. And I'm going to go through and give you some implications of that take on the passage for these exegetical questions. Then we'll get into some evidence. And I want to do it that way because that way I have a chance to lay out the proposal for you to shoot full of holes, at least, when we get to questions. But first, some preliminary comments. The notion of celestial powers, or a divine council, does not necessitate a polytheistic worldview in light of Yahweh's unique transcendence, and many texts in the Hebrew Bible support this idea that God governs with a council, that he has a celestial entourage. Hopefully you're familiar with this idea, because I don't want to get into it too much, but it should go without saying. But I'll say it anyway. I'm a monotheist, so I signed the statement. Okay, so this when we refer to the celestial powers and the gods, those are terms that Scripture uses. So Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him? ... You made him a little lower than the Elohim, the gods. And so we can use that terminology as long as we recognize we're dealing with created beings who are inhabitants of heaven, but who are nevertheless not ontologically God's equal in any sense. He's transcendent and outside of creation. So I want to emphasize that up front, just in case. I don't see any looks of alarm, but just in case, So the celestial powers, divine council. I'll read a brief excerpt from John Walton. He's not in here, is he? I saw him. I was hoping.
Nobody's always friends.
Yeah. That's always a little intimidating. See the eyebrow go up. But as he points out, and as most of you probably are aware, the idea that the gods governed in a celestialist assembly was prevalent in the polytheistic conceptual world of the ancient Near East, as displayed in, quote, many of the Ugaritic texts, as well as a wide variety of texts from Mesopotamia. End quote. While the Hebrew Bible significantly modifies this picture by postulating a transcendent eternal creator God whose power is unrivaled, it does not totally break from the belief in a divine council administrating world affairs. Walton observes, Isaiah 40:14 insists that Yahweh has no need of consultation, yet the council has not totally disappeared. It is no longer made up of gods, and its members are delegated the task of carrying out the decisions of the council rather than being delegated any actual authority or jurisdiction. Now, I'm going to disagree slightly with that statement, and I think you'll see that here in a minute. But, and here again we get to the preliminary comments. If you look at the preliminary comments here, the next one is that my thesis depends on a certain view of Deuteronomy 32:8 and Psalm 82. But I wanted to highlight that Walton quote just to show the difference there, and also this common idea that the divine council is a prevalent motif in Scripture, and we're going to see it a bit more. You see it in the beginning of Job, where the sons of God present themselves before God. You see that conceptual background in the prologue there. But Deuteronomy 32:8, pretty well-known verse, but I'll just read it for us here. It's in the Song of Moses. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now you're probably aware there's a major text-critical issue there in Deuteronomy 32:8 at the end. Some texts, I believe the Masoretic text has sons of Israel. But most scholars agree sons of God is original there with Qumran. The LXX has angelos theou, angels of God. And so probably it's sons of God and there was some confusion, and so we end up with, well, who exactly does that refer to? And one text tradition went with those are the Israelites, and one went with those are the angels. I'm going with sons of God there, and most scholars do, but not all. So again, not universally accepted, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of that. My interpretation of this verse, my take on it, is when God allots, when He divides mankind, when He fixes the borders of the people, He puts divine intermediaries over the nations, celestial intermediaries, but He keeps Israel as His special portion. He rules them directly. And I think that same backdrop is reflected in Psalm 82. So I'm going to read a little bit of that for you. Again, pretty well-known chapter because it's quite controversial in some schemes. Psalm 82:1, God has taken His place, or He takes His stand in the divine council. This is the Adad El, the council of God, or perhaps the assembly of El, the Canaanite high god. We have this phrase in the Ugaritic text. Ugaritic, right? Yeah. Some debate over what exactly is being said here. It seems that there's a polemic that Yahweh is passing judgment upon the gods. And indeed, He says in verse 1, in the midst of the gods He holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality toward the wicked? Give justice to the weak and fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. This is the English Standard Version, by the way. I probably should have pointed that out earlier. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Down in verse 6, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High. All of you, nevertheless, like men, you will die and fall like any prince. So my take on that passage is that the divine powers, the divine intermediaries, whom God has in some sense delegated authority, have failed to produce justice, to promote justice or to enact it, to keep a certain level of decency in human society. And that is the reason for His wrath. So that's my take on those two passages. And that's the background I think should be imported into Isaiah 34. So that's where we're at so far. Now, the advantages, or I guess the solutions that approach offers to these exegetical challenges are as follows. And I've just patterned these on the questions that are found at the top of the page, that first page with the gray bar. At the bottom of that page, you see solutions to the exegetical challenges. Number one, God is angry with the nations because they and their divine rulers, their divine host, have failed to rule justly. To 2 and 3, what role do the heavens and heavenly powers play, and why does God attack them? Well, again, I'm arguing that host in Isaiah typically refers to celestial beings, especially if we include that title, Lord of Hosts. We'll come back to that phrase in a minute. And that the host that Yahweh is truly upset with in Isaiah 34 is the divine council, the rebellious faction of the heavens. The host, which I think I read the Net Bible earlier, is translated armies in Isaiah 34:2, of the nations, I think transitions us into the heavenly host that we see in 34:4 and 5. But again, the answer there is God attacks the heavenly powers because of their misrule of the earth. Number 4, Edom is emphasized, and I haven't got to this yet, and so I want to take time to articulate this. Possibly because of its association with rebellion. So again, Edom was a vassal to Judah, and it rebelled. So it had unique association with rebellion. So what better place to talk about a setting for the judgment of rebellious gods than to have that take place in conjunction with Edom. Also because Edom became, at least in later rabbinic literature, a symbol of the enemy other. So any enemy, later in rabbinic literature again, could be considered an Edomite. Now we don't know how early that goes back, but it could conceivably have begun around this time. Yeah. Deku is Bert Deku. Is Edom, Israel's twin and brother, is the resource I've got there. Another possible reason why Edom might be associated with the judgment of heavenly powers is because Edom is associated with divine heights. We see this in Obadiah. Now, probably later text, but I'm not going to read it. But Edom is associated with the divine heights and pride and the lofty stars. And so this idea of the heavenly powers fits naturally with the judgment upon Edom. And finally, I think because locating a judgment of the celestial powers in Edom evokes Yahweh as the warrior of Seir imagery. And we see this in the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32, and in other texts, particularly Judges 5. So that's why I think Edom is the locus of this judgment on this conjunction of divine and human hosts. Number 5, sacrifice as judgment imagery in the prophets is particularly cataclysmic, which makes it appropriate for a judgment against the divine powers. Further on, I note that this imagery seems reserved for extreme cases of judgment. Jeremiah 46, Ezekiel 38 and 9, Zephaniah 1. And if you read these passages, these are not just God using one nation to judge another. There seemed to be a divine conflict and a major eschatological event in each of these. It pushes us to think beyond just God judging one nation. Also, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself down in the evidence column, but as Pope pointed out, this passage is somewhat unique in that Yahweh mediates judgment directly. He doesn't use another nation to wipe out Edom. He doesn't bring in the Babylonians or the Assyrians. He picks up his sword and he fights directly in chapter 34, which again makes sense if we're talking about a judgment against divine powers. Back up to the top of that page, number 6 and 7. Miskal calls this section with all the little animals calling to themselves and inhabiting to the land and holding court and talking to their neighbors. It's very anthropomorphic. He calls this the uncanny kingdom, and I think it's a good turn of phrase. He would actually, I should point out, he would actually see some of these animals as demonic, Lilith, and some of these other. There's a tinge of the supernatural. I don't see that there, but I like the phrase uncanny kingdom. And I think he's right to point out this is a counterpoint to the eschatological kingdom in chapter 11. The lion lays down with the lamb. Again, this possibly allegorical way of describing society, animal society, and projecting it onto, or as a mirror image, I guess, of human society. And I think the function here, and the reason that it's given in terms of allotment and inheritance, is as we saw in Deuteronomy 32:8, Yahweh allots, he divides the nations, he puts boundaries, and he does so according to the number of the sons of God. And I think the animal society at the end of the chapter is a parody of that. And they are allotted and they inherit this land because it's been removed from the sphere of the divine powers. Number 8, the Scroll of Yahweh, which is, again, a rare image, invokes the idea of a heavenly book of destinies. And I'm following Oswalt on this. So there's a number of different options here over what that means. None is very clear and compelling on its face, and I'm not going to discuss each of them. But I think if we approach this chapter as this is a judgment upon the divine powers, then it makes perfect sense that Yahweh is the one who decrees fates, who sets destinies. And so when the reader is invited to consult the Scroll of Yahweh, look and read, none of these animals will be lacking their mate. It's going to be as I say it's going to be. That brings us to this notion of Yahweh as supreme king who decrees fates. And I don't know if I have it down here. No, I don't have it as a counter-argument. But one common objection to that view is, of course, we can't actually, the reader can't consult the Book of Destinies, right? So how can that be Well, I would argue that's a rhetorical imperative. We're not actually meant to go look at our personal copy of the Book of Destinies any more than the initial imperatives for "come near, you nations, and listen." I mean, that's also a rhetorical imperative. Of course, the nations aren't going to gather around physically to listen to the prophet. So this rhetorical imperative, I think, is a good way of dealing with that objection. Finally, and this is where I think it gets interesting, and this is where I get, if I haven't gotten radical enough, here's where it gets interesting. I think Isaiah 34 continues the ongoing theme of the judgment of the entire world as a process of reorganizing the hierarchy of the heavens. So the stars, or the sons of God, fall from heaven, which necessitates a new divine order, a new heaven as well as a new earth. So if you stop and think about that, in the third part of Isaiah, we end up with a new heavens and a new earth. Well, why do you need a new heavens in addition to a new earth? Well, presumably for the same reason you need a new earth, and that is the corruption of its inhabitants. So I think that's the movement, the theological narrative that we're getting in Isaiah. The stars fall from heaven, and we need a new divine order. And Yahweh names his servant to be a new heavenly light. So the servant's described as a new light. Now, well, let me finish my thought here. A divine viceroy who will obey him perfectly and bring justice to all nations. So when we think of the servant's ministry as evangelicals, we typically jump to the suffering aspect of it, which obviously for good reason it's there. But one common thread that runs through the servant songs is this notion that the servant will bring justice to all nations. Which, how can he do that unless he rules them? Again, that is a direct fulfillment of the role that, at least I'm arguing, was predicated upon the divine powers in Psalm 82 and in Yahweh's administration of the earth. And he's wiping the stars from the sky and putting a new heavenly light up to eclipse them. So that's what I'm saying. There's a thematic movement there. And again, the servant's role is to establish justice in all nations, and he's also characterized by perfect submission to Yahweh, which is a direct contrast to the rebellious powers of heaven. And I think that's why, one of the very first narratives you have in the New Testament, Matthew, who is very closely linked to Isaiah and Christ's ministry with the Isaianic serpent and the branch and all that. That's why Matthew's gospel begins with a new star in heaven. I think he's drawing that directly from Isaiah. Now, I realize there are some kind of weird doctrinal directions that one could go with that, and I'm not going to get into that, but please don't go there, I guess, and don't assume I'm going there. I guess what I want to say is the fact that I see the servant replacing the divine powers doesn't mean I see him as an ontological equal. I think, again, I'm a Trinitarianist, so just throwing that out there. That's my take on the passage. And I realize I've given you very little by way of evidence, so that's what I want to do now. But I wanted to make sure that the view of the whole was there. So you can really hit me on that with the questions if you want. But just to briefly survey how I see the evidence converging on that particular take on this passage. The structural markers and linguistic features of the poem indicate a unified composition. So we talked about Meilenberg. He points out, and I'm going to read a quote just so you can get a sense of how he feels about it, because we're not going to have time to really break down the Hebrew text really closely. Structurally speaking, the oracle begins with the summons to gather and listen and to pay attention, two imperatives that form an inclusio with seek and read at the end of the chapter. We talked about that a minute ago. So those dual imperatives, and there's no others in the chapter, form an inclusio that kind of bind the whole. In fact, this oracle begins in a manner very similar to the book as a whole. we'll pass over that for now. Within the passage, Meilenberg has identified the primary structural markers. Quote, "The four expressions introduced by Key give us the four main themes of the first great section of the eschatological poem, which are plainly the wrath of Yahweh, verses 2 to 4, the sword of Yahweh, verses 5 to 6d, the sacrifice of Yahweh, 6e to 7, and the day of Yahweh, 8 to 9. Each possesses a perfect unity and is controlled by a single dominant thought." End quote. So those four key clauses tightly bind and structure the first part of the oracle. Now, once we get into the list of animals and their activities, the structure isn't so clear. But what we do have are some theme words. The notion of the host provides one theme word, heavenly host, in verses 4 and 5, and also human host, or perhaps ambiguous, including both in verse 2. The word slaughter, Edom and Bozrah, the scroll or the book, the Sefer, in verses 4, and down at the end of the chapter, verse 16. Also, this notion of drinking. So Yahweh's sword is drunk in heaven. Driver wants us, I can't remember what that Bible did there. Driver wants us to say that well, let me just read you the quote. He says it's hardly credible that Yahweh's sword is drunk in heaven, presumably with blood. And so he wants us to change the text, or not change it, but he wants us to follow Qumran and a Targumic reading, which has Yahweh's sword appears in heaven. But this idea of being drunk or sated is present there in verse 7 and following, and it actually is another one of those linking words that binds the text together. So we have these linking words. We have sound play. We have a number of other factors that help show us that this is a unified composition, and that's why Meilenberg was so impressed with it. And so it's a little puzzling that even after that, scholars want to come along, as Matthews does, and see different layers to it when there's so many structural markers. Even right there in the beginning, where the key clauses just are 1, 2, 3, 4. There seems to be a literary relationship. Oh, I'm really closing in on. Yeah, sorry. Let me skip down to bullet point 3 there. The celestial powers already play a prominent role in Isaiah. Zeitz argues the divine council provides some thematic continuity in chapters 40 to 48, that the ethereal voices in chapters 6 and 40 are manifestations of God's entourage. Isaiah 24:21 explicitly states that Yahweh will judge the heavenly powers. Perhaps I should have led with that, especially because we're closing in on time here. But just to read it, Isaiah 24:21, "On that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of earth on earth." So, very explicit statement that not only expresses the punishment of the divine powers, but also connects them to human rulers. We have Leviathan, Rahav, Tanin, all in Isaiah. So there's this chaos kampf motif. Some see that as pretty muted in the Hebrew Bible. Others want to bring it out really to the forefront. But the characters are there. At least we can say that. I think I'm going to have to leave it there so that I give you time for some questions. And then if there are any questions, maybe I'll just run down the rest of the list.
Okay, we have a couple minutes for questions if you have any.
With respect to Psalm 82 as a condemnation of heavenly powers, do you deal at all with the way Jesus seems to use that psalm in John 10? And it seems like he's he refers to those gods as being human. I don't know if you touched upon that at all in your
No, I didn't, because I limited. I wanted to limit it to the Old Testament. I will say I don't think we can totally. I don't think we can dismiss that. I think that does play a part in how we interpret Psalm 82, interpreting the text as a Christian. I do think that does play a role. We can't just bracket it out. However, and I just read something on I don't think. I'll say that I don't think Jesus' statement precludes the idea that Psalm 82 is talking about heavenly powers. I think it actually strengthens his argument when he says, I have said you are gods, to whom the word of God came. I think he may be actually recognizing that divine powers are part of Psalm 82. And I think it can be interpreted that way. Jesus' words can.
There's some connections between Isaiah 34 and Genesis 1. Does that play into your analysis at all?
Yeah, it does. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I didn't get to it down here. But under the second to last bullet point under evidence there, tohu and bohu both appear in verse 11, and that collocation only occurs in Genesis 1, in Jeremiah once, and here. And so, I think there is a very explicit connection to Genesis 1. Meilenberg actually thought that the allusion was to Jeremiah, but I don't. The timing of that, of course, depends on a certain critical view. But I think there's the implication here is there's a return to chaos. And I think, again, that's evidence that we have something here more cataclysmic than just Edom singled out for judgment for a particular historical crime.
I enjoyed your paper. I'm sympathetic with that approach, and I think that understanding, use the word carefully, mythological background to some passages in the Old Testament, I think that perhaps can shed some light on them. One question I have is which one is the controlling paradigm? Is it more of a Genesis 1 situation where God creates the whole host and then they're undone, so it goes back to tohu bohu, so it's not so much the personal host of heaven, but the stars is more conceived more impersonally, or is it more like Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, which has some merits as well? I guess I'm open to either way, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why you would go with the personal understanding of the host as opposed to the.
Well, later on in Isaiah, God talks about I created the starry host. I lead them out by name, and so I think that there's a personal element of it there. I didn't get to it, but I think the term host, tzavah, carries special weight in Isaiah. Of 70 times it's used, 63 of it's the Lord of hosts, which I think refers to the divine host, the armies of the Lord. But several other times, the rest of the time, except for 2 instances, it seems to have a clear connotation of heavenly powers. And of course, host of heaven in chapter 24-21, you can't punish an impersonal host. He's punishing agents, moral agents. And the connection with the stars and the heavenly host in this passage, I think, lends itself to a more of a personal feel. And what's interesting, and I didn't get to this either, and I'll probably end with this, but that phrase host, which appears, again, 70 times, plus or minus a few, depending on text critical issues, doesn't appear in 3rd Isaiah. So this notion that the heavenly host is wiped out and replaced with a new heavenly light seems to be underscored by the way that the term appears. And actually, there's a thematic use of Isaiah 41, comfort, comfort my people, her time of hosts is ended. I think there may be a play into this theme as well.
Okay, we're at time, so appreciate Joel's presentation.